In this lesson, we're going to discuss group policy and the group policy processing order. A policy is a set of configuration settings. Policies can be applied to domain users and domain computers. Essentially, you're able to push configuration settings from the domain controller to individual Windows clients within the domain. This is beneficial because the administrator doesn't have to go from system to system making the same configuration changes over and over. Collections of policies are grouped together and stored in a group policy object, or GPO. Each GPO contains a collection of settings that can be applied to all the different Windows clients in the domain. They manage actions such as configuring registry settings, running scripts, applying templates, and setting up software. Any computer running Windows that's not joined to a domain will use local group policy settings. This means that if you have a bunch of computers on your network that aren't part of a domain, you're going to have to go from one system to another to set up various policy settings on each individual system. This would require a lot of time and effort and could result in inconsistencies, access problems, and security risks. But if your computers are joined to a domain, then both the domain group policy settings and the local group policy settings are applied. If the policies are different, the domain policy settings overrule the policy that was configured on the local system. Policies within a group policy object are divided into two categories: computer configuration settings and user configuration settings. A computer configuration policy is applied to the computer itself. This means that no matter who logs into the computer, the policies are applied. These policies could include which software is available at startup, password restrictions applied to all user accounts, network security settings, or registry settings applied to the entire computer. User policies are enforced for specific users, so it doesn't matter which computer the user logs in from. Those policies will always be applied. One computer system may have several user accounts, each with a different user configuration policy. User policy settings could include which software is available when a user logs on, which scripts run when a specific user logs on or off, and which registry settings are applied to an individual user. It could also be used to include security settings and a list of favorites for a user's web browser. There are hundreds of different configuration settings that can be applied using group policy. We can't possibly cover all of them in this video, so we're going to only discuss a few of the most important settings. Account policies are used to control things such as password settings and account lockout settings. Audit policies can configure auditing for various events such as logon, account management, or privilege use. User rights assignment determines which actions a given user can perform on a computer. Security policies limit user activity on a computer. For example, allowing a user to install drivers or requiring Control-Alt-Delete to be pressed to log on. Registry policies configure specific registry keys and values. They can also specify whether a user can read or change a specific registry value. File system policies configure file and folder permissions that apply to multiple computers. And lastly, software restriction policies define what software is allowed to run on any computer that's joined to the domain. Software restriction policies can be applied to a specific user, or they can be applied globally, which means they affect all users. The group policy processing order. This processing order is important to understand because it dictates which policies you need to configure, where you configure them, and how they're applied. You'll want to remember this acronym, LSDOU. L comes first in the acronym because the first set of policy settings that are applied come from the local group policy. Local group policy is kind of like a backup default set of policies that are applied just in case the system can't connect to the network and the group policy objects defined in the domain can't be applied. After local group policy settings, any group policy settings attached to an Active Directory site are applied. GPOs attached to a site apply to all domains and OUs within that site. Depending on how your network is laid out, your domain may not have sites implemented or may not have group policy settings configured. Once your local group policy settings and your site group policy settings are applied, the default domain policy is next. This is where you want to configure settings that affect most of the users and computers on your domain. Next, any group policy settings attached to a specific organizational unit are applied. Because these policies apply only to one particular OU, they only apply to that OU and its sub-OUs. If you have nested organizational units and each OU has its own GPO linked to it, then the GPOs are applied in order as you move down the layers. As you move through this order of precedence, LSDOU, any group policy setting that's applied later in the process will override any policies assigned earlier in the process. For example, say the local group policy requires that a password must be at least 6 characters. However, the domain group policy requires that a password must be at least 12 characters. The 12-character policy assigned to the domain cancels out the 6-character policy assigned to the local group policy. A group policy object, or GPO, is a collection of settings that can be applied to a group of users or computers. Several factors determine the group policy settings that are applied to a given object in the Active Directory domain. Now, an important concept to understand is scope. The scope determines how all the configurations specified in the GPO's policy settings will impact the users and computers inside of that OU, domain, or site. It's possible to narrow the impact of a GPO using a process called scoping. Scoping is the process of targeting a GPO to specific users or computers. For example, a security filter allows you to exclude or include specific users or computers. A WMI or Windows Management Instrumentation filter allows you to exclude or include a system based on operating system or available disk space. Through group policy inheritance, settings are applied to all objects below the container where the GPO is linked. The GPO settings inherited by any object are the sum of all the settings from all GPOs. When you apply policy settings to more than one GPO, you could create a conflict. When this happens, the GPOs with the higher precedence overrule the GPOs with the lower precedence. At startup, the group policy client extensions follow the group policy processing order, and GPOs are applied in order: local, site, domain, and then OU. Each GPO has 2 parts, a group policy container and a group policy template. The container stores data about the GPO, including the version, when it was created, and how often the computer and user settings were modified. The container is found in Active Directory. The group policy template includes multiple files that can contain settings. This template is stored on each domain controller. GPO configuration settings can be found in the Administrative Templates folder known as the Central Store. This folder has multiple subfolders that configure Windows components like Control Panel, Shared Folders, the desktop, and printers. Additionally, you can use the Central Store to hold administrative templates for any application that offers group policy support. If you create your own administrative templates, they're stored as .admx files in the file system on the local server. Each of the files in the Central Store are replicated to each domain controller across a given domain. When working with Active Directory and Windows servers, you'll hear about rights and permissions. They sound like the same thing, but they're not. Permissions govern your ability to access objects like files and folders. Permissions can be applied to individual user accounts, but it's much more efficient to apply permissions to group accounts. For example, you can restrict a user's access to files and folders by specifying that all users who are members of a particular group will receive read-only access to certain files. Other users who are members of another group could receive read-write access to those same files. On the other hand, you use rights to define who is authorized to log on to a computer and the type of actions a user may perform on the computer system. Rights are a part of the security policy for the computer. They can be assigned using the user rights assignment in the local group policy editor for local policies or under Group Policy Management console for domain policies. Each user rights assignment policy has a group policy name associated with it. Rights assignment policies can allow many actions such as accessing a computer from the network, adding workstations to a domain, changing the system time, backing up or restoring files and directories, and loading or unloading of device drivers. These policies can also deny actions such as logging on locally, logging on through remote desktop services, or accessing the computer through a network.